So I'm gonna try to do a series and a playlist where I'm gonna focus more on female creators and female-centric fiction, and I'll be defining female broadly. It doesn't have to be necessarily directed or written by a woman, but if it's female-centric, I think it should be given some exposure. This is not meant to be pro-feminist. It's not a political thing. I am just gonna be looking at the creations per se, and we'll go from there. There is going to be genuine criticism where it's warranted, and that is definitely the case with Queen of the Damned is fairly mixed, and perhaps not in a good way. So what is Queen of the Damned? Well, this is essentially the third book in a trilogy in the Vampire Chronicles by Anne Rice, who wrote Interview with the Vampire. The Vampire Chronicles spans a lot of books. It's a very, very big mythology. I have read Interview with the Vampire as well as Queen of the Damned. You might think that's sufficient to draw some conclusions, but to be fair, The Vampire Lestat is the second book, and there do seem to be details I'm missing because this is quite a tonal shift from the first book, and some of the world building details seem to contradict what we learned with Interview with the Vampire. And I have tried to study Anne Rice seriously through the secondary literature, so I'm a little confused how all this comes together because it increasingly gets more and more wacky. So what happens with Queen of the Damned proper? Well, the story itself is actually fairly small and simple, but there's a lot of details she adds in. So Lestat decides to put out an autobiography called Interview with the Vampire. He becomes this big star. He's drawing attention to the vampires. He's telling a lot of secrets through his lyrics. That's alarming a lot of the vampires, and they want to go after him. Simultaneously, Akasha, who apparently is the queen of the vampires, returns after a very, very long time of, I don't know what you want to call it, dormancy. And she and Lestat go off together. They seem to have a kind of romance. And she unveils a fairly ridiculous, cartoonish supervillain plot, and the other vampires gather together to face off against her. And it's a struggle of, I guess, good versus evil, kind of. And there are a lot of fascinating characters. One of the ones I really liked was Kamon. I really enjoyed him. I don't even know if I'm pronouncing that technically correctly because Kamon is Egyptian or from pre-Egyptian times. He was a fascinating figure. So there's a lot of characters here. But probably the ones you wanted to spend more time with, like Louis, they do come in, kind of, but they're sort of cameos. So there's a lot of room for just all these different characters. But the zigzag plot, after a while, gets a little tiresome. Probably the strongest section here is the mythological backstory we get with Akasha and the origins of the vampires. But you sort of have to be a completist because the way they explain it and go through it is, it's kind of like a miracle story, and I found that a little weak. It's finally good that we got some answers, and Anne Rice's vampires are fairly interesting and unique within the canon of vampire fiction, but we didn't know quite why they did certain things but didn't do other things. For instance, they're vulnerable to sunlight, they're vulnerable to fire, but they seem to be otherwise immortal and invincible. And in the Interview with the Vampire, Armand tells us that, well, a lot of vampires just commit suicide. They can't stand immortality. They have their very specific traits and their very specific dispositions, but we don't know why, and this kind of tries to explain why they are the way they are. Some of it makes a lot of sense, but a lot of it is just still very hokey and kind of very thin. Nevertheless, some of the new characters are very interesting and intriguing, but the way they're presented is kind of obscure because they're saved for a twist, which is frankly not that good. It's kind of weak, really. So the build up to the conclusion is pretty strong, but once we get there, the resolution is super quick. It's just like, it's over like a second. It's like, that's it? And the solution to the grand crisis that they set up is, again, it's kind of weak. It just comes out of nowhere, and you're like, that was it? That's all you had to do? Really? So it just feels like the basic story is good and strong, but she just added so much voluminous detail. But some of it I did like with Kamon and some of the characters I did like, but if a lot of these characters may not work for people, and then when you think through the world building details, does this really make a whole lot of sense? Some of it is very fascinating and interesting, but a lot of it is like, where are we going with this? What is the point of any of this? But it's good that stylistically and tonally she's challenging herself and challenging her audience. But sometimes it does feel like we're just doing wheel spinning and she's just showing off her style for no reason, and we're not really going anywhere. But overall, I did like this book. I think it's a strong addition to her work, but it does have quite a few drawbacks, and it may not work for everyone, especially if this is your first Anne Rice novel. You'll probably not want to read her from going forward, but give her more of a chance. She definitely is a good stylist, but I do think in terms of her plotting and world building, you can definitely see her ambitions, and that should be applauded. And of course, artists should not be told to hold back, but this can be tightened up or eliminated or reworked. It is what it is. It is her voice. It's very authentic. I will forewarn, this has a lot of graphic violence, a lot of graphic sex. So if you're into that stuff, great. But if a lot of it is perhaps a little bit too much, yeah, this may not be for you. Overall, really strong, but very, very weak in certain places. I'm going to give this a 7 out of 10, and I do recommend it, but come in with not low expectations, but don't expect Interview with the Vampire Part 2. That's not what's going on.